I first ordered Go Brewing online, and Sunshine State instantly became one of my favorite beers. Then I tried the Story Double IPA, and it was game over. Founder Joe Chura, who's actually been a guest on this podcast, leads the team making award winning non alcoholic craft beer right in house with real ingredients and legit brewing methods. With over a dozen styles, there's something for everyone. Go to gobrewing.com. Free shipping on orders over $200 and 2-day delivery. Save an additional 15% with code NATION15. That's NATION15. All right. Jennifer Moss is an award-winning author and workplace culture strategist who has been a regular contributor for the Harvard Business Review, CNN, Time, and Wall Street Journal. Her latest book, Why Are We Here?, which I have a copy of here in my hand, explores the future of culture and organizational well-being, which I think in a broader sense is very related to the mindful drinking movement that we obviously talk about on this show. So Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to the US of NA.
I am so glad to be here. This is definitely a new conversation, but there's lots of connection points. So thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So we'd love to start off by just talking a little bit about your career journey. So, we'd love to hear what got you into studying things like workplace culture and employee burnout, which feels like are maybe even more relevant now than when they were when you first got started in this field. So, what brought you in and what do you find most interesting about it?
Yeah, this is a great question. And my career journey is definitely like most people's. It's not been this linear. Yeah, I didn't go to school for accounting, and then I've been an accountant my whole life. It's definitely had a lot of shifts. But I started out as a journalist, and that was my main focus. I went to school for journalism. That was going to be the plan. I was really interested, though, in a lot of the writing that I was doing was on workplace culture. And I was working actually in communications for a company called Robert Half International. And they were so early on in the thought leadership, doing research and really digging into what is going to make a great workplace, and what are the types of salaries that people should have, looking at pay equity just across the board. And so it was like bringing in my journalism and that interest in workforce insights. But then my husband, who is a pro athlete, became ill, and we had this interesting experience in the hospital where we were realizing that a lot of his psychological fitness, and that comes with being identified as a high performer and an athlete, and you get all this coaching really early on, was a big part of his healing. We've sort of flash forward. We ended up starting up a company called Plasticity, and it's the idea of the neuroplasticity of happiness. How do we build well-being? How do we build psychological fitness? Which turned into a startup that went into a stay up. It was a tech and consulting company. And when we decided to end that after 6-7 years. And and a big part of that was because I was burned out. And we're running this happiness company. I am I'm a national columnist, happiness columnist. I'm considered a happiness expert. And I was the least happy I've ever been in my life. And a lot of that had to be reconciled. I had to understand it. And I started to look into the research. And what I found is that, burnout is really institutional stress, workplace design flaws, it's policies and not feeling supported. It's discrimination. It's, being a woman trying to fight for funding for a company in a totally, imbalanced power dynamic. So that's what really brought me into starting to write for Harvard Business Review on burnout, which led to the book, which they published. And that's really then, I find that now Why Are We Here is kind of a companion piece to that. And, here's the problem. And then Why Are We Here really goes into, the burnout epidemic talks about solutions too, but the Why Are We Here is kind of like, now what do we do? How do we bring the hope and the purpose and the meaning back to a very burned out workforce?
No, it's fascinating. And, I think your story is very similar to what we hear.
Mhm.
Just startups in general, it could be very chaotic, even though it could be a lot
Yes.
of fun and energizing, eventually you can't be on that hamster wheel at the same pace forever. And
Yep.
we've all, whether we've started companies or not, I think we've all been there at some point in our
Yeah.
careers. So that's
Mhm.
interesting. And I'm sure for you, being a happiness expert and going
Right.
through and experiencing that yourself, I'm sure was an interesting dynamic. So you
Yes.
mentioned your first book, Unlocking Happiness at Work, which I think you just republished or published an updated edition for
Yep.
earlier this year. And so I'm curious, there's been some more recent trends like things like AI and hybrid work,
Mhm.
which seems to have come out of the whole return to office, which is still going on, but maybe has settled into some sort of an in between, at least for some companies.
Right.
So I'm curious how, those new developments maybe further complicate matters when it comes to whether or not we're while we're at work.
It's fascinating to go back to that 10 years ago when I first wrote Unlocking Happiness at Work, and there's so much of what I said in that book that I'm still saying today. I feel like, in the pandemic, when there was a lot of mobility within the workforce, we saw organizations really investing again and putting a lot of time and intention around programming to prevent burnout for well-being initiatives. They were focused on flexibility. I mean, going from 4% of the workforce to 37% of the global workforce working remotely within 6 weeks is a dramatic pivot. And so they were responding to that in what I think was a really healthy way. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they needed to retain and attract a lot of workers at the time. But I see that being clawed back. And so some of the things that I was saying again back 10 years ago is that, when organizations lose power, they tend to do what employees want, which is work life balance, which is well being. Like a lot of people really just want those fundamental human things. That's what they're asking for. But when they gain that power back, it's like they take that away, those fundamental things, which I think is a big miss. And so I feel like, yes, it's an ebb and flow conversation, but I was feeling a lot of optimism in those, I would say a few years ago, that we were, righting the ship. But I think a lot of folks in this space right now are feeling like we're going in the wrong direction again. And so things like policies like return to office policies, if you just look at the data, and this is data from an economist, if you're a capitalist leader and you don't even care about the human centered part, 5 days return to office mandates actually are contrary to you being a capitalist. And fully remote isn't necessarily the best way either. It is some sort of mix of seeing people and also giving people that autonomy. So there's been a lot of things that have been given and taken away. And I think that's eroding the happiness of our workers right now.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So in a former life, I worked for Steelcase Corporation, which was
Yes.
also very much focused on the workplace, and I would say was also ahead of the curve in trying to understand that since it was core to their business. And it really, these new trends. I've been out of the corporate space for about 10 years or so. And I look to, my friends and colleagues and other people that are still within those companies. And you look at things like AI, which
Mm-hmm.
we're really still in the very early innings of, and just the
Mm-hmm.
stress that's putting on people. Is it going to take my job? Is it, going to change how I work? Am I
Right.
going to have a job? And some of those questions. And yeah, you're right. I think it is an ebb and a flow, and it does feel like we're going to this extreme where the companies have all the power and they're using that power. And at some point, you have to imagine that pendulum might swing back the other way. Um, I'm curious to get your thoughts on more the physical office space a little bit. So,
Yeah.
and by that I mean obviously things like the office space itself,
Mm.
having access to green space or even just sunlight, in the office,
Yeah.
which used to be something that was not designed for, and became, especially during my Steelcase days, was something that was a big focus area. And then of course, things like healthy snacks and beverages. So, we're a podcast generally about mindful drinking and wellness.
Mhm.
So, just curious how you see some of those physical elements play into the mix as well.
Well, the office for me needs to be thought differently from what are we using it for versus even pre-pandemic. And I have to say, had I actually just went and did a talk for Steelcase when I was in the UK, and I have a lot of respect for how they think about it. And I did appreciate that they were doing some work with Susan Cain around
Mhm.
the idea of building space to think of the introvert. And so they were really, Herman Miller was doing a bit of that, and Steelcase was really leading the way, I think, in that design of what that looks like to be collaborative. And it's even more critical right now. And in Why Are We Here? And one of the chapters I write about the office being the third space. So, even though Starbucks made the third space, the concept of that, which is, we have work and home and then the third space, and Starbucks really co-opted that from a marketing standpoint. But it actually goes back to World War II, where there was this Russian dissident that created this space for people to go from all different cultural perceptions and religions and race, and everyone was invited to these places to disagree and to have conversations that really changed the way that everyone was thinking about the world at the time. And that's where that came from. And so, when we really think about work, isn't that a place where we are supposed to be thinking about innovating and collaborating and having, healthy disagreement and figuring out how to make, the world better, make products better for people? And what's happening and what I see now is that people are replicating the in-person experience in the office. So we've increased meetings by 252%. There's a huge amount of time poverty. And what people are experiencing in the office is that even if it's open or closed, they're just sitting at their desk. They never leave. They don't get up to eat with each other, which is super unhealthy. And they're having their meetings all day long. There's no social community piece, that those rituals are missing. And so we need to make the office a third space. And that means getting together to have lunch, having more shared spaces where you eat together and it's non-work related, but it's about team building. And we should have work sprints together. So spaces where people can sit side by side, but they're working on projects, they're talking, making it so that there's always sustenance. So people feel like, not that they want to live there. I don't believe that it should be like the days of old where, it was life on site. But I do believe that it should be a place where you're going there to do something different than what you would be doing in your home. And that is something that I think some spaces are getting. I think Atlassian does a really good job of that, of creating the right space and environment for that. And they're a fully distributed model, but at any one time, I think it's 91% occupancy in their spaces, even though they don't have to be there. So that's what I think we need to do, is make a space that's healthy, collaborative, focused on being around each other, but then also having spaces where you can get quiet time. But the quiet time from a flexibility standpoint should be the ability to work remotely if you need to. So changing that in a transformational time and what the office means and the space means, I think is a critical piece that a lot of leaders and organizations have been missing.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think, we are that hybrid structure. It makes sense that would also, cross over into our home work life as well. I mean, for instance, when I was working in corporate America, I realized that I'm very productive when I'm in lounge mode. So when I'm sitting in more of a lounge posture versus, sitting at a regular desk. And so I'm sitting right now in a lounge chair that I do 90% of my home-based work. And so it's, kind of replicating what I had in the office for me to be comfortable at home, I think is definitely important. I did want to come back to.
I'm on a couch right now, and I love to sit. This room in front of me is filled with light. It's my favorite spot in the house. I love sitting in this chair. It's very cozy. I have my pets around, and I'm so productive in this space, and I know whenever I'd go into the office, I gravitated to the chairs, or I love the sense of coziness while I'm working. And so you need to think about where people feel most productive, and replicating some of those things that people love about being at home, but not making it so that they're sitting on Zoom meetings all day and never getting a chance to get up
Right.
from their their desk. I actually, and I want to say there's this great Cornell study that found that people that ate just for 20 minutes a week, this is 20 minutes a week outside of their desk, had higher morale, had they were more productive, but they also made less mistakes, so they were more efficient. I mean, all of these great data points and business outcomes came from just 20 minutes of sitting together and having lunch. So these are the things, the gray area stuff that I think is what intentionally really improves culture and makes it healthy, and not the big value changes, or, or deciding that we're going to focus on, caring this year. It's about really just demonstrating caring by giving people time to enjoy each other.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think too, we haven't talked about inclusivity, but I think, relating that to sort of the mindful drinking, I think that's a big lever, or big reason that people are doing that. And I think, companies are starting to recognize that with having non-alcoholic options, maybe at company events, and, having healthier things in the office than sugary sodas, or things like that. And so I think we're also seeing a little bit of a shift in that. And I think, that could also play into some of that physical space when people are in the office, and then maybe that carries over into home as well, if they're discovering things in the office that they want to have for themselves. So
Yeah, I can't imagine being in a place that's full of light all day and then being told I have to be 5 days in an office where there's no light. I mean, it would be really hard on a mental health standpoint, which translates into all of these business outcomes. When people aren't well or happy, it's going to impact your business success. So yeah, you have to think, if you're taking someone out of a light filled environment and putting them in an environment that feels dark, or they're an environment where they can go to their fridge and get healthy food and fuel themselves, to an environment where that's not an option. So yeah, you really want to have empathy in design, for sure, in all aspects of workplace policies and spaces.
absolutely. So we were talking earlier about how the pendulum seems to have swung towards companies having the power and maybe wielding that at employees. In your newest book, Why Are We Here? There's a line that resonated with us, I think, to that point, where you said, mental health, well-being, and DEI are still leadership side hustles for the most part. And even though I haven't been in corporate America for 10 years, I wasn't surprised, or I'm not surprised to see that. And I certainly hear that, I think, from many of my friends who are still in that world. But I'm just curious, given how much research, which you've of course been a big part of, and just investment, there's been a ton of investment made in each of those buckets. But yet, I think, to your point, it's still viewed as very extraneous to the mission. It still feels like something that's not really core to the values of many companies. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on why you think that still is.
It is even there was an investment, like I said, leading up to 2022, and you started to see an increase in chief well-being officers that were directly reporting to the CEO, to the C-level. So that was a really good shift. But since 2022, we've seen that decline, where entire well-being departments and teams have been gutted, and they've removed their chief well-being officer. They have changed their name for DEI to talent management, and they're maintaining it, but they don't want to actually put it out there that they are still supporting DEI. It's not everywhere, but you're seeing there was a huge investment in the US, and then that was pulled back. But you're seeing that across North America and Europe as well, which is unfortunate, because it was just had a tiny moment in time where we were seeing, okay, this is going to not be a side hustle. This is actually going to be something where there's going to be big investment. But what we've always found is it's usually someone leading an ERG, that it's like an employee resource group that they're in charge of, and then that's the well-being focus. Or so it's volunteer work. It's not even a paid role. Or you see the CHRO, for example, the Chief Human Resources Officer, take on well-being as part of that, or take on DEI as part of their role, instead of having someone specifically leading that. And as we all know, and I'm sure you would probably be able to recall this quickly from your corporate days, if there isn't some sort of budget line item attached to that person's role and the expectation of how they're spending it, and there's agreed and committed to investment, it's always way down the line of priorities. You
Right.
have to imagine that these C-level executives have a million other things that they're doing. So tacking on well-being or tacking on, diversity, equity, inclusion is going to not be something that they can juggle unless they're measured by it. And I think that's still today. We're even seeing more retraction and investment from that. So until there's actually a real focus on it. And for me, and I write in the book too, that the whole idea of inclusion and equity and diversity, for me, it really is a talent strategy. It's not a benevolent strategy. And we keep saying like, this is human-centered leadership, and I'm going to be an ally. And if you are just a smart, intelligent, savvy CEO, you know that diversity and the data together map to higher growth, more competitiveness, better return on an investment to shareholders. There's so much data that says these things equal a more competitive organization. So it's not just a nice to have. We do this because we're smart CEOs. And I think we've really conflated this idea of it's like a generous, benevolent strategy to increase, inclusion. And no, it's business. And once we start to think about it in that way, I think we take all of the politics out of it, which would be really great to see.
Right. Amen to that. I was going to say you're absolutely right about the sort of the revenue side of things. Anytime you have an initiative, especially when it gets to be expensive, if it's not directly tied to revenue, especially in the short term, which, the reason that all of these things may make sense is for more of a long-term gain, which does
Mm-hmm.
impact the bottom line positively.
Yes.
But it's not going to be as easy as investing in, new salespeople or, a new marketing campaign
Right.
or things that might directly drive more customers and more revenue into the door. So it
Yeah.
is interesting to see. And hopefully as these become, more to your point, outside of the political realm and more just evaluated on their own and the
Yeah.
long-term positive impacts that can come from that, we'll see some changes.
I think too, and I'll just add this, I think too that once we get better, and that's something that, I'm working on with a group of partners right now, is that when we get better at measuring and quicker measurement and attaching it to ROI, you just remove all of the gray area. And I think that, AI and technology and some of these other things haven't done a good job of that so far, but we are seeing a better way of mapping to interventions around these things, investment in DEI. And instead of it being, a 3-year research study where we come up with data, if we're better able to map the ROI very quickly, then it becomes the sales. It becomes as measurable as if you put this one person into sales and we increase sales by 15%. Once we start to put it on that same level from a measure and data gathering standpoint, I think it makes it a little less questionable,
Yeah.
or it's buffered from those questions about their value.
Right. Absolutely. To shift gears a little bit, so I know you talk a lot about the generations in each of your books,
Mm-hmm.
and we're in interesting times now where we have multiple generations, including Gen Z, who's been in the workplace now, and obviously it's been they've had a little bit of a rough haul with
Yeah.
given COVID and other impacts to the work world in their short time there. But in talking about Gen Z specifically, you talk about the needs around their well-being and some recommendations that leaders might want to keep in mind to attract that particular demographic. And I think a couple of the things you mentioned were things like wellness spending accounts, and maybe, investing or letting them choose alternative medicine options as part of a health plan. And so I'm curious, Gen Z at this point is, they're sort of the new kids on the block, and the oldest ones are maybe 28 or so years old. So most of them are not in leadership positions yet.
Right.
But as they do move up in the corporate world and start to have, more leverage, as we've seen with the millennials and every other generation before them, what are some of the things that we might expect to see being asked of from that generation. We know they're leading things like wellness. We know
Mhm.
they're leading things like not drinking as much, frankly. So I'm
Yeah.
just curious
Mhm.
what impacts that might have. And obviously that's a bit of an open-ended, we don't really know, but I'm curious with your expertise what you think that might look like as they progress in the workplace.
There's a lot of desire for flexibility when it comes to their, employee assistant programming, or their EAPs, their benefits. They want to have more autonomy because some of the things that are jammed in there are just not relevant to them at this with this cohort. So having autonomy around that is really helpful, and the way that they think, about their own health is very different. What we see along through the different generations. But what I also found, which I thought was really neat in the data, all the research, is that every generation essentially wants the same thing, but Gen Zs are really, they amplify that message. And so they're sort of getting hit with this brush of, I just want work life balance, and I'm lazy, entitled, and this is what my expectation is. And the thing is that they're like any other generation. They want that autonomy. And when you look at this piece of data, was really, really interesting to me. So you look at mature workers who are just at early retirement, and you look at Gen Zs. Both of them, are 1 in 4 of them in the US, are primary caregivers for their family. And Gen Zs are caring for older adults and siblings, and grandparents now are primary caregivers for their grandchildren. And we always kind of look at the benefits and support around parenthood, or those policies around caregiving for older millennials and Gen Z, or Gen X's, sorry. So we need to realize that there's a lot of bias in how we think about what the needs are for various cohorts, but in general, they want, they want flexibility. They want to be able to feel like the benefits that they're being provided are based on life choices and the space that they're in. We're seeing a lot of Gen Zs having children later. They're making decisions about their financial health because they don't feel like they have any, and that's another benefit that we need to be thinking about, is supporting around, financial stress, which is huge for this group. And it does lead to things like, and I write about this too, this impulse buying, or or spending, overspending, and not having support from their workplace to be able to help them think about that. But they're not spending it on alcohol in the same way as Xers and boomers did. They don't have that environment that they're expecting to go into, where it's, where it's not like Mad Men, where you're sitting around and having a gin and tonic at your desk. It's very different. So they're coming in with very different expectations. And I also want to say that, Gen Zs have been raised to have feedback, to communicate what they need, have had open conversations. They weren't raised to have deference in the same way that Xers and boomers have expectations of. So one of the biggest things that I've been saying inside of organizations and for leaders is stop having this implied expectation and then being frustrated when this person who was not, raised in any way and has never had the experience of having this expectation on them, be frustrated with them when they don't deliver on it. We need to have more explicit communication. We want to come in and an onboarding, say to Gen Zs, what is your career plan? What do you want? How are we going to get there? This boss over here really likes when you come in, he's an open door kind of guy. This other boss over here, she would prefer it if, there's respect and deference. She would prefer this, or, they would like it if you, set a plan for them, or you manage up. Like, that's what a leader should do, is lay out what the expectation is, the different personalities that that person is going to interact with, making sure that they know how to be trained to handle conflict and managing up. And none of that's happening because Xers and boomers think Gen Z should just walk into the office and know all the stuff that they know. And it's different. And so I think that radical acceptance that we're in a different environment would make everyone less frustrated, and we'd feel more like, as a generational divide, that gap would be a little bit more closer.
Right. No, this is so interesting to me, and we could probably do an entire podcast just talking about some of the
Yes.
generational things in the workplace. I mean, I'm Gen X. I remember when we came into the workforce, we were the overeducated slackers, and then
Right. Yeah.
before I left corporate America, I had a lot of millennials on my team who are in the same space that Gen Z now is, where, a lot
Right.
of them at that point were late 20s, I guess maybe early 30s in some cases. And, there were negative stereotypes about them. And, I think they've turned out okay. And I think the same will be
Right.
true of Gen Z. It's just
Yep.
having that acceptance and understanding of each of them. But it's a good segue. The other question I wanted to ask you around generations is, we always, it feels like every time we talk about generations in the workplace, it's always, the conflict between them. We've all seen memes of, here's how a millennial, handles it when their one-on-one gets canceled. Here's how Gen Z or, boomers, and we all have a good laugh about it.
Right.
But it does feel like, society wants us to, all of the generations to be tribal about
Yes.
where we are in life. And I'm curious to get your feelings. I think in your book you talk about how
Mhm.
Gen X, for example, has a lot of the same values that Gen Z does. They may not be as forceful about them, and it may not be, they maybe didn't grow up with them in the same way, but they also want healthier, healthier lifestyles,
Mm.
workplace well-being and balance and things like that. Is wellness something that we all can agree on? Can that be a uniting factor for all of us in the workplace?
You're bang on. That is exactly what we need, because every single research, data point, analysis, study that I looked into, it was across the board. It's a human thing. It's not a generational thing. And I'm an Xer too, and we're the silent generation, and I do write about the fact that we're really sort of like a badge of honor is that like we're not complaining, or we'll just do it. But then there was this really great stat that I learned, was that millennials are leapfrogging us about
Mm-hmm.
20% of the like we're having this 20% increase in millennials leapfrogging Xers, because Xers are not comfortable in saying this is what I need and these are the expectations that I have. And so we're doing a better job too as Xers of like raising up the younger generation, but boomers are just not necessarily succession planning with us. So, across the board, there's just every generation has stuff and stressors and things that they're dealing with. It's life. Like every part of our life, we've gone through these different experiences. So of course, we all want the same thing, which is time. We want to be able to spend time in things that give us joy. We don't want to be overworked. The root causes of burnout, these are all the lack of hygiene needs. And we want to have autonomy and agency in things we do. We don't want arbitrary policies that are making us sick to be part of our everyday. We want to feel like our work has meaning, that the things that we do actually matter every day, and that we're not just cogs in a wheel. I mean, these are the things that we've been talking about probably since work was you know since the days where we were building the pyramids. We probably had the same feelings about work that haven't changed. And I think that that's this universal desire, and for work to not feel like a grind, for work to be enjoyable, for there to be some levity, for you to have some friends, and for it not to suck the life out of you. So it's not a Gen Z thing. It's an every human thing.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well, this has been a really fun conversation. Before we let you go, we'd love to just hear what you have coming up, or what are you excited about? And I guess we'd be remiss, since this is a podcast about mindful drinking. I know we were chatting earlier about mocktails and things like that. So if you want to share any favorites of yours or your family's, would love to hear that too.
Well, there's two that we love. One of them is my mother's punch. She makes this punch and we don't even know what it is. It's like this just magical thing that everyone asks. My daughter, when she was 2, used to call it pear juice, and there's no pear in it, but she just loves it. And it's a mix of, old school cans of frozen orange juice mixed in. And then we've got frozen, I think there's frozen um, pineapple juice and cranberry and soda, and everyone just loves it so much. It's like our favorite thing to do, and it comes out in the holidays. And so right now it's not an all-time thing. It's just very special. It comes out in the holidays. And when my mom brings her big punch over, which is going to be in the next week over to my house, it's like, it just has so much nostalgia. My kids ask for it all the time. And, and it gives us so much joy, which is a perfect example of how, we go to certain things that we think are going to make us feel happy. And it's like, for like alcohol and some of those other things. But my mom's punch is like, probably makes us the happiest of
Yeah.
anything you could probably consume. Right. So a lot of it is so tied to our psychology and our attachment to things. And this is for me, like the spirit of holidays comes with my mom's punch.
Oh, that's great. So how about on the work side, anything coming up in terms of, I know you just published Why Are We Here earlier this year, but anything else coming up that you're excited about?
I'm really excited for the launch of my workbooks. I've been working with the team for so long, and you would have known from the books that I write, it's very much leadership, system focused. How do we attack the systems that are really impacting individuals? And I've said a lot, self care alone is not the cure for burnout. You cannot take a bath and cure systemic discrimination. You can't listen to rain for 30 seconds and it's going to solve for a 70, 80-hour work week. So I have made a point to take a while in developing these workbooks that are for individuals to manage burnout, but not from a self-care standpoint, but really from system standpoint. How do I talk to my manager about, dealing with the workload I have? How do I have this conversation if I feel like I've lacked that community? I feel lonely in my organization. How do I have better conversations with my coworkers? How do I fix the systems in whatever locus of control I have? And so I've really taken this as like, the anti self care. There's obviously some self care parts to it because that matters. You still need to rest. If you've hit a wall, you need to rest. But it really is in like, how do we prevent it from the ways that I can to fix the design flaws in work? And that's coming out in the next couple of weeks. And it's been a labor of love and a many years to get here, but I'm really excited about the launch of this because I feel like a lot of times I'm talking to leaders and employees are like, well, what about me? What can I do,
Yeah.
to deal with this problem? So this feels like I'm giving another tool to the individual and not just a book that tells them to breathe or, to calm
Right.
down.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Download the Calm app and listen to
Yes.
that for 45 minutes. No,
Yeah.
I mean, your books are always full of, I think, actionable insights, especially for leaders who are reading them. And so I'm sure the workbook will be great to give employees some of those tools and things that they can think through. So look forward to hearing more about that. And the book is Why Are We Here? Again, it came out earlier this year. We'll put links to all of this that we've talked about in the show notes. And Jennifer, really appreciate you taking the time with us today.
Thanks so much for hosting me. This was great. Great questions, and it was a lot of fun. So thank you.
Go Brewing really cracked the code on a THC infused drink that tastes like beer. I tried Easy Man Hazy and couldn't believe how flavorful and balanced it was. Founder Joe Chura, yep, the same guy who's been on this podcast, created Easy Man for the new wave of hybrid drinkers. Made with buckwheat, millet, and oats, it's not technically beer, but it sure tastes like it. With a smooth 1-to-1 THC to CBD ratio and low dose options, it's a mellow, balanced vibe. Hit drinkeasyman.com. Free shipping over $200 and 2-day delivery. Save an additional 15% with code NATION15. That's NATION15.